Strangely, Kamala Harris's big inspiration was her grandfather, P.V. Gopalan, who worked for the British Imperial Administration Service in India. A loyal bureaucrat who didn't seem to have a single rebellious bone in his body. Maybe Kamala simply wanted to avoid drawing too much attention to her parents, who met in a radical student organization whose members were instrumental in setting up the Black Panther Party, which had a hardcore Maoist revolutionary line. Gopalan's daughter, Shyamala, could have studied in the rigid traditionalist and cold Britain, yet she chose sunny California in the United States, where all kinds of radicals met under the guise of a civil rights movement. Shyamala wore Indian clothing and was sometimes mistaken for some kind of princess. Somehow she ended up in an African-American group where she met Donald J. Harris, who had been born in Jamaica, another former British colony. This was her first real relationship, and they soon got married. One of their daughters is Kamala, who spent her formative teenage and young adult years in Canada. The current monarch of Canada is King Charles III. As the living embodiment of the crown, the sovereign is regarded as the personification of the Canadian state. In the 20th century, Britain ended the traditional imperialist structures but tried to maintain a strong intelligence presence in the former colonies. The USSR used the opportunities presented by the newly independent countries to increase KGB activities. What's even worse, Britain has had some secret relationship with the Soviets through aristocrats like Lord Louis Mountbatten. In February 1947, Mountbatten was appointed Viceroy and Governor-General of India and botched the partition of India into India and Pakistan. Intelligence services in and outside of Britain suspected him of being a Soviet asset or collaborator. In the early 20th century, Britain already launched its own socialist movement through the Fabians and the London School of Economics. The Labour Party is more or less the tool of the Privy Council. Shyamala Gopalan stood in line to register for classes in Berkeley in the fall of 1959, while the person standing behind her was Cedric Robinson, a black teenager from Oakland. He was part of the Afro-American Association at Berkeley and later became a professor. His best-known book, Black Marxism, The Making of the Black Radical Tradition, is the blueprint for the new generation of a black intelligentsia. Just like Marx, Robinson spends 95% of his writings criticizing the status quo in the past. The descendants of slaves and post-colonial people of color were supposed to be united under a common ideology. Robinson, like Marx, does not care to explain how a revolution is supposed to work and what happens afterwards. If African Americans took over a fraction of the US and turned it into a state, who would be a factory worker and who the privileged administrator? What would the new government do with unhappy citizens demanding change? How would they be their own thing and not a satellite of the USSR dictatorship? Robinson's book, just like Karl Marx's work, only serves to create chaos and get the ball rolling, presumably to Moscow's benefit. In the fall of 1962, at a meeting of the Afro-American Association at Berkeley, Shyamala Gopalan met a graduate student in economics from Jamaica, Donald J. Harris, who was that day's speaker. In 1963, they were married without following the convention of introducing Harris to Shyamala's parents beforehand or having a ceremony in her hometown. The founding member of the Afro-American Association was Donald Worden, who mentored Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale, who co-founded the Black Panther Party in 1966. In 1969, J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI, described the party as the greatest threat to the internal security of the country. It was clear to every security professional that a literal army of fighters could one day overwhelm the police capacity of the United States. The FBI sabotaged the party with an illegal and covert counterintelligence program called COINTELPRO. Harris told a room full of black students that he had grown up observing British colonial power in Jamaica, the way a small number of whites had cultivated a native black elite in order to mask extreme social inequality. Of course, he himself turned out to be a rather privileged and well-connected man. In 1960, 17 African nations gained independence. The same year, Fidel Castro was received with open arms in Harlem, where he met with Malcolm X, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, and Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru of India. In 1963 and 1964, 5 members of the African American group joined a trip to Cuba organized by the Student Committee for Travel to Cuba in defiance of a State Department travel ban to see how Afro-Cubans lived under Fidel Castro's government. Donald J. Harris attended the University College of the West Indies before earning a bachelor's degree from the University of London and a PhD from the University of California, Berkeley. He served in Jamaica at various times as an economic policy consultant to the government and as an economic advisor to successive prime ministers. Harris's ancestor was probably Christiana Brown, who descended from Irish-born plantation owner Hamilton Brown. Brown was awarded a payment under the Slave Compensation Act of 1837 as a former slave owner in the aftermath of the Slavery Abolition Act. The British government took out a huge loan with interest from Nathan Meyer Rothschild and Moses Montefiore, which was subsequently paid off by the British taxpayers. Now, of course, the Crown controlled these bankers, not the other way around. Check out my other video on that. Not just how traditional conspiracy mythology is false, but that it was also created by British intelligence. At various times, Donald J. Harris was even a visiting fellow in Cambridge University and Daly School of Economics, and visiting professor at Yale University. He was a Fulbright scholar in Brazil in 1990 and 1991, and in Mexico in 1992. Now, of course, Yale University also goes back to British networks, especially the secret societies at Yale. Very much British old networks in America, very secret. And that also became a problem when, the British aristocracy had a special deal with the Soviets. Kamala's grandfather, P.V. Gopalan, joined the Imperial Secretariat Service during British rule in India. He served as Undersecretary to the Government of India in the Ministry of Transport. In the 1950s, he was posted as a senior commercial officer in Bombay. He worked on the rehabilitation of refugees from East Pakistan in India. Rising through the ranks, Gopalan was later empaneled and served as Joint Secretary to Government of India and Ministry of Labour, Employment and Rehabilitation. He was later deputed or loaned to the government of Zambia and lived in Lusaka as Director of Relief Measures and Refugees in 1966 during the Zimbabwean War of Independence to help Zambia manage an influx of refugees from southern Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe. So now we get to the speculative part of this whole affair. Who is Kamala Harris really? What was the actual influence on her? What did her family maybe prepare her to do? Now, there are several possibilities. The obvious one would be Soviet intelligence. Now, that's, of course, self-explanatory, how these mechanisms worked back then. The USSR tried to infiltrate the United States and some of these former colonial countries. Therefore, it would have made sense to recruit P.V. Gopalan and then also recruit that guy's children and then the next generation. That would have been an obvious goal, but that's just one scenario of several, of many. When you look at some videos of Kamala Harris, you can sort of see how she dresses up like an aristocrat, like a privileged person. She probably has a whole makeup team and a hair team and professional videographers and professional lighting, professional everything, right? She just claims to be for the little guy and stand up for the common peasants out there, but she herself seems to be very, very privileged. Just like her grandfather was already a privileged guy. And we know how the British ran their system. They wanted to recruit certain families and cultivate these families over generations. So one guy, in this case it would have been P.V. Gopalan, he had to prove his utter complete loyalty to the British system or British intelligence. And so it was also expected of Gopalan to ultimately recruit his own children, or at least some of his own children. And then the next generation would have to prove their loyalty. So in that hypothetical scenario, Shyamalan Gopalan was tasked with spying, sent to America, sent to Berkeley, meant to spy on her fellow students. Now that wouldn't have been her entire job, her entire gig, more like a partial job, partial gig. And so, and then of course the expectation would have been to also recruit Kamala, in the next generation, and have Kamala do things for the empire, right? Now, of course, it's clear that Kamala's father was also privileged. He was also connected. He didn't want to tell that to his audience there in that African American group. It's likely that he spied for some British networks, but it's not clear how much in the know these people would have been, Kamala's father and Kamala herself. So what would the British have told them? Or how much would the British have obfuscated the true dynamics and the true networks? So there's like a possibility where, Harris and, the Donald Harris and Kamala were told, well, it's all about creating a leftist system. We want to create a new woke left system. Everything's going to be controlled. Everything's going to be peaceful. And ultimately, the world would be at peace, because if we become more similar to the East, then the East becomes a bit more similar to us. We can all happily merge these superpowers and have world peace, and that's kind of the big goal here. That may have been an explanation given to these assets. Not necessarily a true explanation, but there's also another variation of this. This is when you would tell your assets it's just about a command and control system. This is about continuing the British Empire model, but under a new disguise. It's all about controlling people, and it's all about creating and managing or prolonging an aristocracy, even a secret aristocracy. Right? So in that case, Kamala and her ancestors would have known that it's not about creating a nice left system, or breaking the bourgeoisie, or preventing any sort of aristocracy from ever happening again. It's more like, it's continue the British Empire with a new coat of paint, sort of like what the Labour Party has done in Britain. And the Labour Party, you can check out my video on that with Mr. Stormer. The whole Labour Party is a tool of the Privy Council. Everybody who was really important in Labour was a member of the Privy Council and very much tied to that system. And even in the creation of the Fabian Society in Britain, or the London School of Economics, you see these hardcore imperialist guys who basically tell you in their books, we need a new form of imperialism. The old system doesn't work anymore. It's just much too chaotic. We have to re-educate the populations in order to want a system of control, and to embrace it, or just to see any alternative as horrible. Okay, so this is kind of how it makes sense for an old-style aristocracy to push left-wing ideas and just create more left-wing structures of control. In traditional counterintelligence training, in traditional anti-communism, you're looking for communist spies. You're looking for very classic communist spy rings, right? So that's what you're trained for. You're not trained to understand old intelligence networks, aristocratic intelligence networks. You're not supposed to find them. You're not supposed to know that they even exist. And you can find a lot about these old networks in my books. You can find them on Amazon.com. So there's a whole nother player. It's not just traditional communist structures. It's also these aristocratic structures. And these aristocrats had a special deal with the Soviets. This is kind of the problem you are dealing with here.